The Phantom Major, David Stirling's brother, Bill Stirling. His brother invented the SAS and became a legend, but Bill Stirling created something even more dangerous, a unit so secretive that the British government tried to erase it from history. While his famous brother fought in North Africa, Bill Stirling built a private army in the mountains of Europe, conducting operations so brutal and effective that both the Germans and the British feared him. He assassinated enemy leaders, armed resistance movements, and operated with almost no oversight. This is the story of the shadow warrior who was too dangerous even for his own side. Stay until the end to discover why the man who won battles in the shadows spent the rest of his life being investigated by his own government. William Joseph Stirling was born on July 4, 1911, at Keir House in Perthshire, Scotland, into the same aristocratic Scottish family that produced his younger brother, David. Bill, as the family called him, was the third son of Brigadier General Archibald Stirling and Margaret Fraser. Like his brother David, Bill grew up surrounded by wealth, privilege, and the expectation that Stirling men would serve Britain with distinction. But while David would become famous as the founder of the Special Air Service, Bill would forge his own path, one even more secretive and controversial. Bill Stirling's childhood at Keir House was idyllic in the way that only aristocratic Scottish childhoods could be. The family estate sprawled across thousands of acres of highland terrain, forests, rivers, mountains, and moorland where young Bill learned to hunt, fish, and navigate difficult terrain. The Stirling family had owned Keir for generations, and the estate represented not just wealth, but centuries of Scottish history and tradition. Bill grew up knowing he was part of something larger than himself, a family legacy of service and leadership. But unlike his younger brother David, who was rebellious and unfocused, Bill was more serious and intellectual. He was an excellent student, showing particular aptitude for languages and history. He attended Ampleforth College, the same Catholic boarding school David would later attend, but Bill's experience was very different. He excelled academically, took his studies seriously, and seemed destined for a conventional career in law, politics, or the military. His teachers described him as thoughtful, disciplined, and unusually mature for his age. After Ampleforth, Bill attended Trinity College, Cambridge, studying history and modern languages. He was a scholar more than an athlete, though he maintained the physical fitness expected of young men of his class. Cambridge in the 1930s was intellectually vibrant, but also politically turbulent. Europe was descending toward another war. Fascism was rising in Germany, Italy, and Spain. Many Cambridge students were politically engaged, debating whether Britain should rearm, whether to support the Spanish Republic against Franco's fascists, whether another war with Germany was inevitable. Bill Stirling watched these developments with growing concern. He had studied European history extensively and understood that Germany's grievances from World War I, combined with Hitler's aggressive nationalism, made another war likely. But he also believed that conventional military thinking, the kind that had led to the trenches and slaughter of World War I, was obsolete. Future wars would require new tactics, new organizations, and new ways of thinking about military operations. After graduating from Cambridge in 1933 with honors in history, Bill joined the Scots Guards, one of Britain's most prestigious infantry regiments. He received his commission as a second lieutenant and began the traditional career path of a British Army officer. But Bill was already thinking unconventionally. He studied guerrilla warfare, irregular operations, and the history of special operations forces. He was particularly interested in how small, highly trained units could achieve strategic effects out of proportion to their size. Through the late 1930s, Bill served in various conventional military postings. He was promoted to lieutenant, then captain, demonstrating the competence and professionalism expected of Guards officers. But he was also developing ideas about special operations that were far ahead of his time. He studied T.E. Lawrence's campaigns in Arabia during World War I, analyzing how his small Arab forces had tied down entire Turkish armies. He read about irregular warfare throughout history, looking for patterns and principles that could be applied to modern conflict. When World War II began in September 1939, Bill Stirling was serving with the Scots Guards in a conventional infantry role. The British Army mobilized, and Bill's unit prepared for deployment to France as part of the British Expeditionary Force. But Bill believed that conventional infantry operations wouldn't be enough to defeat Germany. He began advocating for the creation of special operations units that could conduct raids, sabotage, and irregular warfare behind enemy lines. In 1940, after the British evacuation from Dunkirk, Britain faced the possibility of German invasion. Winston Churchill, now Prime Minister, called for the creation of units that would set Europe ablaze through raids and sabotage against German-occupied territories. Bill Stirling volunteered for these new commando units, which were being formed to conduct amphibious raids against German positions in occupied Europe. Bill joined No. 8 Commando, later renamed Ley Force, after its commander Colonel Robert Laycock. This was the same unit his younger brother David would join. The Stirling brothers were both in Ley Force, both thinking about irregular warfare, both frustrated with how the unit was being employed. They discussed tactics and strategy, sharing ideas about how small units could achieve strategic effects. But their paths would soon diverge. In 1941, Bill deployed to the Middle East with Ley Force. The unit conducted several operations against German and Italian positions in North Africa and the Mediterranean, but these operations were generally disappointing. The commandos were being used for conventional infantry tasks rather than the special operations that they had been created for. Bill, like his brother David, believed that Ley Force was being wasted on missions that regular infantry could accomplish. David Stirling would soon create the Special Air Service and revolutionize special operations in North Africa. But Bill's path took a different direction. In 1942, he was recalled to Britain and assigned to work with the Special Operations Executive, SOE, the secret organization responsible for sabotage, espionage, and supporting resistance movements in occupied Europe. Bill Stirling's language skills, his strategic thinking, and his understanding of irregular warfare made him ideal for SOE work. The Special Operations Executive was one of World War II's most secretive organizations. Created in 1940 at Churchill's direction, SOE's mission was to conduct sabotage and subversion in Nazi-occupied territories, to arm and train resistance movements, and to carry out operations too sensitive or deniable for regular military forces. SOE agents operated in complete secrecy, often using false identities, conducting operations that the British government could deny if things went wrong.
In 1943, Bill proposed creating a new unit, one that would combine the aggressive raiding tactics his brother's SAS had pioneered in North Africa with the deep penetration and resistance support work that SOE conducted in occupied Europe. This unit would be called 2 SAS, the 2nd Special Air Service Regiment. But Bill's vision for 2 SAS was different from David's vision for 1 SAS. Bill wanted a unit that operated even more independently, with even less oversight, conducting operations that were too politically sensitive for conventional forces. Bill Stirling was given command of 2 SAS in 1943. He immediately began recruiting men who fit his specific criteria. He didn't want conventional soldiers who would follow orders blindly. He wanted men who could think independently, who understood the political and strategic context of their operations, who could operate for extended periods behind enemy lines with minimal support. He recruited from various units, looking for soldiers who were intelligent, tough, and comfortable with ambiguity. 2 SAS began conducting operations in Europe in 1943 and 1944, primarily in Italy and France. But these operations were very different from the raids that 1 SAS conducted in North Africa. Bill's unit worked closely with resistance movements, arming and training partisans, conducting sabotage against German supply lines, and assassinating German officers and collaborators. These operations were brutal and often involved killing in ways that regular military operations didn't, shooting unarmed collaborators, ambushing German units from civilian areas, using tactics that blurred the lines between warfare and terrorism. Bill Stirling's approach to operations was coldly pragmatic. He believed that defeating Nazi Germany justified almost any tactic. If assassinating a collaborator prevented German intelligence from discovering a resistance network, then the assassination was justified. If sabotaging a railway line killed civilian workers alongside German soldiers, that was an acceptable cost. Bill was fighting a different kind of war than his brother. Not the relatively clean warfare of desert battles, but the dirty, morally ambiguous warfare of occupied territories where the line between combatant and civilian was unclear. One of two SAS's most controversial operations occurred in Italy in 1944. Bill's unit was supporting Italian partisans fighting against both German occupiers and Italian fascists. The operation involved assassinating several Italian fascist officials who were collaborating with the Germans. The assassinations were carried out by SAS soldiers and Italian partisans, often in civilian areas, sometimes in front of the officials' families. These operations were militarily effective. They disrupted German intelligence networks and frightened other potential collaborators, but they were also morally troubling. British military leadership began to worry about Bill Sterling's operations. His unit was conducting operations with minimal oversight, killing people who were technically civilians, even if they were collaborators, and operating in ways that could cause political problems if they became public. There were also concerns that Bill was becoming too close to some resistance movements, particularly communist partisan groups in Italy and France, whose post-war political objectives might not align with British interests. Bill Sterling didn't care about these concerns. He believed he was fighting the war effectively, that his operations were achieving strategic objectives that conventional forces couldn't accomplish, and that worrying about political niceties while fighting the Nazis was absurd. He continued conducting aggressive operations, pushing boundaries, and testing how much autonomy British military leadership would tolerate from a special operations commander. The tension between Bill Sterling and military leadership came to a head in early 1944. Bill proposed an operation that was too extreme, even for SOE and SAS standards. A large-scale operation in occupied France that would involve arming thousands of resistance fighters and conducting what amounted to a guerrilla war against German occupation forces. The operation would be massive, difficult to control, and would inevitably result in German reprisals against French civilians. Military leadership rejected the proposal as too risky and too likely to cause political problems. Bill Sterling was furious. He believed that military leadership was more concerned with political optics than winning the war. In March 1944, he resigned his command of two SAS in protest. It was an extraordinary move, resigning command of an elite unit during wartime because he disagreed with how his superiors wanted operations conducted. Bill's resignation was kept quiet, with the official explanation being health reasons, but within military circles, everyone knew that Bill Sterling had quit because he wanted to fight more aggressively than his superiors would allow. After resigning from two SAS, Bill didn't leave the war. Instead, he joined SOE directly and conducted operations in occupied Europe with even less oversight than he had with two SAS. He parachuted into France, worked with French resistance movements, and conducted sabotage and assassination operations in the months leading up to D-Day. These operations were some of the most dangerous of the war, operating in Nazi-occupied territory, constantly at risk of capture, torture, and execution. Bill Sterling's work in occupied France in 1944 remains largely classified even today. What's known is that he worked with various resistance groups, helped coordinate resistance activities in support of the D-Day invasion, and conducted operations against German forces. What's suspected but not confirmed is that he was involved in operations that were too politically sensitive for public disclosure, possibly including operations against French collaborators that bordered on extrajudicial execution. When France was liberated in 1944, Bill Sterling returned to Britain. The war in Europe would continue until May 1945, but Bill's active operational role was essentially over. He had spent 3 years conducting some of the war's most secretive and controversial operations, operating at the edge of what was acceptable even in the context of total war. He had proven himself as a special operations commander, but he had also shown that he was difficult to control and willing to push boundaries that made political and military leaders uncomfortable. After the war ended, Bill Sterling faced an uncertain future. Unlike his brother David, who was celebrated as a war hero and founder of the SAS, Bill's contributions were largely secret. He had commanded two SAS and conducted operations in occupied Europe, but almost nothing about his work could be publicly acknowledged. The assassinations, the work with communist partisans, the operations that pushed legal and moral boundaries, none of this could be discussed openly. Bill was also under investigation. British intelligence agencies were concerned about Bill's relationships with communist resistance movements in France and Italy. During the war, these groups had been allies against Nazi Germany, but now, with the Cold War beginning, they were potential enemies. Had Bill Sterling become too sympathetic to communist causes? Had he shared information or made commitments during the war that could compromise British interests in the post-war world? These questions led to investigations that would shadow Bill for years. The investigations never resulted in charges or formal accusations, but they had a chilling effect. Bill Sterling, who had risked his life repeatedly in Europe, who had conducted operations that helped defeat Nazi Germany, was now being treated with suspicion by his own government. It was a bitter outcome for someone who had served with such dedication and effectiveness.
In the 1950s and 1960s, Bill Sterling became involved in various business ventures and served on corporate boards, using his aristocratic connections and military background to build a respectable civilian career. But he never spoke publicly about his wartime activities. Friends and family knew he had done something important in the war, but the details remained mysterious. Bill took his secrets to his grave, honoring the secrecy oaths he had taken even decades after the war ended. Bill's relationship with his famous brother David was complex. David received all the public glory for founding the SAS and revolutionizing special operations. Bill had commanded two SAS and conducted operations that were arguably more strategically important, but he received no public recognition. There's no evidence of jealousy or resentment between the brothers. They remained close throughout their lives, but the contrast in their public profiles must have been difficult for Bill. William Sterling died on March 16, 1983, at the age of 71. His obituaries mentioned that he had served in World War II with Special Forces, but they couldn't describe what he actually did because most of his operations remained classified. It wasn't until decades later, as wartime documents were gradually declassified, that historians began to understand the full scope of Bill Sterling's contributions to the war effort and the controversial nature of some of his operations. Modern historians studying World War II special operations recognize Bill Sterling as one of the war's most effective, but also most controversial special operations commanders. He understood irregular warfare at a level that few of his contemporaries did. He was willing to conduct operations that others considered too politically sensitive or morally ambiguous. And he achieved results. His operations in France and Italy disrupted German forces, supported resistance movements, and contributed to Allied victory. But Bill Sterling's legacy is also complicated by legitimate questions about the operations he conducted. Did the assassinations of collaborators cross ethical lines? Did working with communist partisans compromise post-war British interests? Did his push for operational autonomy represent necessary flexibility or dangerous lack of accountability? These questions don't have simple answers, and historians continue to debate them. The moment that defines Bill Sterling's legacy came not from anything he said publicly — he never gave extensive interviews about his wartime service — but from a private letter he wrote in the 1960s that was discovered after his death. A friend had asked Bill whether he regretted any of his wartime operations, particularly the more controversial assassinations and sabotage operations that had resulted in civilian casualties. Bill's response was revealing. He wrote that in total war against an enemy as evil as Nazi Germany, conventional morality had to be suspended. The Nazis were systematically murdering millions of people. Any operation that hastened their defeat was justified, regardless of conventional ethical boundaries. He didn't claim to feel good about everything he had done, but he was certain it had been necessary. The people he had killed were either active enemies or collaborators who were helping the Nazis. Their deaths had saved lives and shortened the war. Bill also wrote that the post-war investigations of his wartime activities showed how quickly peacetime society forgets the realities of war. During the war, aggressive operations against the enemy were encouraged. After the war, those same operations were investigated as potential crimes. This hypocrisy frustrated Bill deeply. He had done what was necessary to defeat Nazi Germany, and being investigated for it years later felt like betrayal. That was Bill Sterling, a shadow warrior who conducted operations too sensitive for public acknowledgement, a special operations commander who pushed boundaries and achieved results that more conventional officers couldn't, a man who spent his life being investigated by the government he had served with such distinction. His story reminds us that war requires people willing to do difficult, morally ambiguous things, and that society often treats those people with suspicion once the war is over.